Well, ladies and gentlemen, we want to welcome you to Art for Lunch. We're glad to see you. The Booth Western Art Museum, of course, is real involved in Art for Lunch here at the Encore Room, and also we have the ones that we're holding at our weekly afternoon programs as well. And the next big event that the booth is sponsoring is going to be on the 24th of February, and if you're interested in that, I think we have some literature for them to take home, and that will be also a program on the influence of black cowboys and frontiersmen, Westerners in the development of the American West as well. My name is Jim Dunham. You probably wonder whether or not we scheduled a Buffalo Soldier program because it was Black History Month. And the truth of the matter is, yes, of course. And I hope that this is the end of that. From now on, I pledge to you that we will not just do Black History in Black History Month. It's time that we learn that we need to be using the proper perspective which lets the importance of ethnic and other groups that made such a tremendous contribution in the American West, and we need to place it in the entire year in the proper place that it should have. And the importance, especially of the Buffalo Soldiers, is so enormous. It's not just that they played a part, it's that they played a significant role and a major part of the development in the exploration of the West, and they certainly deserve to be more than just treated with a program every February of every year. So we're not going to let that happen. We're going to make sure. This is our monthly signal that we are ready to start, is what that is. That's yeah, it's our monthly signal. It's great. I have given you a handout. On the handout, I have listed at the back page a couple of recommendations, probably the single most readily available because it's published by the University of Oklahoma Press, and you can get it in paperback in many stores, is probably this one here called The Buffalo Soldiers, and that's probably the most readily available and real easy to get book if you want just sort of a basic book. African Americans served with just about every major battle and war that took place in America from the Revolutionary War to the present time, and yet probably the one that is the most famous is the Civil War, and a lot of people know about that because of the movie Glory. Is there anybody here who has not seen the movie Glory? Because that's your homework assignment if you haven't seen it, okay? You got to go see it. By the way, that was written by Kevin Jarre. The script was written by Kevin Jarre, who also wrote the movie Tombstone. And for many people, it was the first time that they learned how important that the African-American contribution was to the war effort in the Civil War. 180,000 blacks served in the Civil War, and 33,380 of them died. It was a major contribution to the Civil War. When the Civil War was over, the entire military was reduced drastically. There was no longer necessary to have 1.5 million people serving in uniform in the Union Army, and they reduced it down first to about 16,000, realized they needed more than that, increased it up to about 54,000, and somewhere in the neighborhood of about 25,000 soldiers saw service in the American West, in the western frontier, from the end of the Civil War till the turn of the century. A tremendous amount of the work that was done during the Indian Wars was done by the black troopers or the black infantrymen. There were two cavalry regiments that were formed in 1866 that were made up of African American soldiers. That was the 9th Cavalry and the 10th Cavalry. These were formed in 1866. They, almost without exception, served under white officers. And there were only 3 black officers who came out of West Point during those years, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them in the next few minutes. So the white officers were assigned to the black regiments, and there were also a number of infantry regiments as well. And at various times there were 4 infantry regiments that served that were basically made up of black infantrymen. A lot of these guys were young. One of the things that people assume, or maybe they jump to the conclusion, is that they were made up entirely of ex-slaves. A lot of the guys, or a lot of the young African Americans who served in the Indian Wars were young men who were 18 and 19 years old when they enlisted, which means if they were enlisting in 1875 or 1876 or something like that during the Plains Indian Wars, the likelihood is they were not old enough to serve as soldiers in the Civil War. So a lot of these guys were serving for the first time. It was a 5-year commitment to become a private in the military. It was a 5-year commitment. You got $13 a month, which is pretty darn good, because you got your clothes and your place to stay and your bedroll to sleep under the sky and your hard horse to ride, and your in about maybe 18, 20 hours a day work that you could put in. So, but it was, even though it was very difficult, even though it was very hard, it was an opportunity to serve your country and take great pride in your job. And at a time in which jobs were not easy to come by, serving in the military was something at that time considered great honor. There was tremendous prejudice. I mean, you know the problems of prejudice in the world today. You can just imagine the things that faced the black soldiers in the years that followed the Civil War, especially in places like Texas. And many of the black regiments were sent to Texas to control the problems in Texas during what was Reconstruction. And I mean, they faced tremendous prejudices. And there were many conflicts between the cavalrymen and the infantrymen who were sent to Texas during the years following the end of the war, and the various townspeople or white people down there. And almost without a doubt, every time there was a confrontation between a townsperson and a black trooper, the black trooper was found guilty of some kind of a crime, and the white person who caused any trouble was set free by the courts. I mean, it was very, very difficult to find justice in any kind of conflict that took place, especially in the American West that had been also part of the South and part of the Confederacy, which Texas was. But there was tremendous things that the military was doing at that time. One of the most important things they were doing in Texas is to protect the people who had ranches and small communities and towns from the problems of the Comanches, especially, and the Kiowas and the other Plains Indians that were raiding. When the Grant administration came along, President Grant, it's interesting because President Grant is head of the Army during the war, but President Grant's Indian policy is referred to as the peace policy because he really sought to solve the problems through a peaceful resolution rather than a military confrontation. You had some big guns that were heading up the army at that time that would have preferred to just simply accelerate the war and go in there and just annihilate the Native Americans. You had William Tecumseh Sherman, and you had Phil Sheridan, and you had a lot of people who had seen service in the war years. You had George Armstrong Custer, you had Miles, you had Howard. You had a lot of different people who had records in the Civil War, but very few of those generals that came out of the Civil War really sought for a non-military resolution. General Howard was one of the few who sought to solve the problems with the Native Americans in a peaceful manner. But the president wanted to do that, and the president began a policy that was to contact religious leaders for recommendation for who would be the agents. The most important of that time was probably the Quakers, and sometimes it's referred to as the Quaker policy of President Grant, because what he did is he went to the Quakers and asked for recommendations as to who could be recommended to serve as agents for the reservations. Well, in some cases it worked, in some cases it fell apart. It was very difficult all through the early days of reservation period. It was very, very difficult to get honest agents because of the problems of patronage and because of the problems of tremendous wealth. Anytime you put people in a place where they can easily steal money and make themselves wealthy at the cost of others, you're going to have the potential for graft and problem, and the entire whole policy was just rife with these kinds of problems. You had very few people who really stand out as being unusually good agents. Probably among the most famous agents were John Clum, who was an agent for the Apaches, the San Carlos Apache Agency in Arizona. Clum also later became the editor of the Tombstone Epitaph newspaper and was a friend of Wyatt Earp's and was there in Tombstone during the OK Corral debacle. And you had the fellow who was known as Redbeard, who was Tom Jeffords. Tom Jeffords had gone into Cochise's stronghold and met with Cochise. He was unarmed, and he came in and he basically told Cochise that he was coming in peace and that he wanted to work a deal where the mail carriers were not attacked on the basis that they were not military people bringing war to the Apache people. And so he convinced Cochise that the Chiricahua Apaches had nothing to fear from the mail carriers and therefore worked a deal where they didn't attack. Cochise and Jeffords became friends. A very good work of fiction called Blood Brother was done. The book by Elliot Arnold called Blood Brother was based upon that true story of the relationship of the two. And of course, motion pictures have been made, such as Broken Arrow, that starred Deborah Pageant, who has really no place in the true story, and Jimmy Stewart. And so the story has been told in fiction. Most of the people who served as agents of reservations did not do very well. And the reservation system was just full of problems from the very beginning. There were all kinds of problems in trying to get people who were essentially free people with no restrictions, who survived in a hunting-gathering society, to come in and live in these small little clusters. There were a few times when they thought it might work. Very shortly after the year after the cavalry regiments, the all-black cavalry regiments were formed, there was the Medicine Lodge Treaty in the Southwest that the Comanches and the Kiowas and all of your Southern Plains Indians, Southern Cheyenne and Arapahoes, they all agreed that they would stop their warfare and go in peace. And we thought for a long time, or for quite a while, that this was going to result in a very peaceful settlement. But of course, war broke out and it turned into a major battle scene with the military. In the North, in the years following, especially in the 70s and beginning about 1874, they had problems due to the Bozeman Trail and to people traveling across the country. The Indians did not mind so much if as long as a wagon train went all the way across to Oregon or all the way to California, but when they wanted to stop and build forts, which the military wanted to do, they became very upset, and there was an entire war under Red Cloud and Spotted Tail of the Sioux, and then you had, of course, your real serious wars that took place under Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull that became the culmination with the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25th, 1876. The Jenny expedition had gone into the Black Hills in 74 and come back with the information that there was gold in the Black Hills. And that gold in the Black Hills opened the door for white people who had absolutely no legal reason to be there to pour into the Black Hills, which was supposedly going to be held as sacred ground for the Plains Indians. And as long as the grass would grow and the streams would flow, and as long as the rocks were there, supposedly this was going to be land that was going to be owned and occupied by the Plains Indians themselves. And of course, there's no way to keep the white people out when you find out there's gold. They're going to get in there. So the job of the military is very complex and very, very difficult because The job of the military is not only to keep people to enforce the law, but the job is also to protect the citizens. And in a conflict between the Native Americans and the white miners, who are they going to help? Well, they're going to help those people who vote. And so you have to think about it in sort of like, what would it be like if somebody in your family went down to Mexico and wound up in a traffic accident where somebody got injured and then somebody tried to sue them and you got people put in jail, and all of a sudden you have to get the United States government involved. The chances are, if you've got any clout at all, if you've got a friend who's a senator or whatever, if you've got any political clout at all, the first most important thing is let's get that person back into the United States. Let's get that American citizen protected, and then we'll deal with the legal ramifications after that. The United States does not take the attitude of, well, let's just abandon our citizens and not worry about them and leave them up to the laws of whatever country they're in. And that's kind of the attitude that the American government had towards these miners who were breaking the law and pouring into the Black Hills to steal the gold. They had no right there, they had no legal business to be there, but it was a difficult thing because you couldn't just step back and let the Indians kill them. You know, you couldn't do that according to the way how the world works. And so the Indians are attacking the miners. The Indians are causing problems on the various trails, like the Bozeman Trail, and the military gets involved. And among the military to get involved are your Buffalo Soldiers, or your African American troops. When the Indians saw them, and this would be the Plains Indians, probably the Cheyenne or the Sioux, when they saw them for the first time, they basically saw that these were dark-skinned people with black hair that tended to be curly, and it's very possible that their first encounter with these people was in the winter, and if that's so, they not only had the dark hair and the dark skin, but they also probably had the buffalo coats that were issued to the cavalry or to the military, and they were made out of buffalo hides with the fur on the outside, and they even had big, huge gauntlet gloves that were made out of buffalo fur. They literally thought that they looked like buffalo. When the Native Americans saw their first black people, which may very well have been York traveling with Lewis and Clark, the terms that were used to refer to black people at that time were not Buffalo Soldiers, but the terms that were used to refer to them at that time were frequently something that would sound like a black white man. In other words, they first saw them, they called them a dark white man, because essentially these were the same as the white men coming to them, but they just happened to be a different color, so they called them dark white men. And it's interesting because, like, when the Indian saw the horse for the first time, he called it the medicine dog, or the mysterious sacred dog, because that was the closest thing he had was a dog, was the beast of burden, and he kind of related it in those terms. And so that's kind of how he first treats it. But by the time the 9th and 10th Cavalry are out on the plains dealing with the Native American, the term Buffalo Soldier became popular. The buffalo, Tatanka, was sacred. It provided all of the needs of the Plains Indians, especially like the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Crow and the Arapaho and the Blackfeet and the Pawnee and the Indians that lived off the buffalo herds. Trains going by. Yeah. And so the animal was sacred. The animal was a beast with a great deal of courage and a great deal of power. And so the Native Americans called the African American soldiers Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers, or the men themselves, saw that as a name that could be grasped and carried with respect. And so they took that name, they put a buffalo on top of their emblem, of their unit, and with pride called themselves Buffalo Soldiers ever since. Let's look at our first image. Here is Frederick Remington did a whole series of drawings and paintings that dealt with the Buffalo Soldiers. And that's partly because Remington was hired by Harper's Magazine, and they paid his way to go out and ride with and travel with the military, and he got to actually go to Arizona and spend time with the 10th Cav and go on a campaign with them in the mountains of Arizona. And so he, more than any other artist of the time, really did a great deal of artwork that dealt with the Buffalo Soldiers. This fella here is a bugler, and he is dressed up in his dress bugling outfit right there. Let's see the next one. Now this one here is Frederick Remington's wonderful painting of Frederick Remington that almost is reminiscent of the motion picture stuff. Remember how we talked about those of you that heard my program on Frank McCarthy. Remember we talked about how Frank McCarthy's paintings look like they're stills from movies, and this is where he gets it, is from Frederick Remington and Charles Roivogel also making their paintings look like stills from movies. And this is the 4th Cavalry. This is not the 9th or the 10th. This is the 4th. But it's typical of the cavalry in action during the Indian Wars. Where are the bad guys? How many people think the bad guys are where you are? Raise your hand. You're the bad guys. You think that you're the bad guys? Are coming? These guys are charging this direction. Are the bad guys over there? How many people think that? Okay, how many people think the bad guys are that way? Okay, we don't have too many. We're not fooling anybody today. If you look on the back, these guys here are the cavalry shooting in that direction. See, these guys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all these guys are lined up. They are the military, they are the cavalry, they're shooting in that direction. For the most part, during the Indian Wars, we really didn't have a true cavalry in the true sense. What we had was mounted infantry more than we had cavalry. What we did is we had units that would go on horseback to the battle and then dismount and fight on foot. Trying to shoot a rifle from the hurricane deck of a horse is pretty difficult to hit anything, and you could be much more effective with trapdoor Springfields that fired one shot and had to be reloaded. Be much more effective to dismount and fire on foot. The name of this painting is the 4th Cavalry on the move, dismounted, the led horses being led away. And these are every 4th man was a horse holder, and they would run a line that goes through the bridles or the headstalls of these horses over to here, and this man here is taking 3 empty horses out of the line of fire. They're getting them out of the place where they won't get hit and where the other men can fight on ground. This is how the Buffalo Soldiers and most of your cavalry fought from the end of the Civil War to the turn of the century. In the Civil War, it was easier to fight on horseback because the Confederates would fight fair. By definition, that meant that they would face you in a battle. The Native Americans would tend to run away, and they would tend to wait until they had the advantage on their side rather than just get slaughtered in an open field. So the Native American people could be said to be much smarter than the people who fought in the Civil War because they would take off. The result is you couldn't set up a decent charge. They wouldn't charge you, and so you had to find them and fight them on foot. Let's see the next one. This is the courier, and it's a good example of this is Frederick Remington, good example of what the men looked like during this time. The Buffalo Soldiers were basically the soldiers that fought during the Indian Wars. I mean, after all, they didn't call them Buffalo Soldiers in the Civil War because there wasn't any Indians to call them that, or at least, basically. So this is what they look like. This is not a Civil War uniform. This is an Indian Wars uniform, and just this would have been popular, or this would have been the type of uniform that would have been issued in the 1885, 1884, 1886 time. You have a light sandy colored tan hat. You have a blouse, which is a pullover button-up front blouse. You have your sky blue pants. You have your web belt rather than a leather belt. You have a material or cloth cartridge belt. You have your issue Colt 45, and then you have your tall boots. And these neckerchief things or whatever are not issued. Because of the dust, of course, it was very advantageous to do what the cowboy did, which is to wear a bandana that you could pull up over your face and protect yourself from the dust, but they were not issued. And so these should not be yellow, like they are in John Wayne movies. They should not be yellow, and they should not necessarily have a pattern. So what Remington is doing is he's showing basically that some are wearing them, some are not wearing them, and Remington paints a lot of white ones, and it's probably likely that the white was available at the sutler's store, and so they tended to get white. So, but they would be any different color that they could possibly get. And this is your good example of your McClellan saddle, which was meant to be comfortable for the horse rather than for the man. Next picture. Of the 3 men who graduated from West Point and served as officers, this was probably the one that has the saddest story. And this is Lieutenant Flipper. The other ones that were, as far as graduation, there were 2 other ones, and Alexander and Young were the other 2 men who graduated. Alexander served, I think, 7 years in the military and died in a active duty situation. Young had the longest time in the service, and he actually had a 30-year career as an officer. This is one of the worst things that we did. We literally made it almost impossible for a black man to get through West Point and become an officer. It's a disgrace that with as many people that served in the United States Army, that we only allowed 20 men to go to West Point that were black, and then they were treated so horribly and so badly. They were treated so badly that only 3 were able to put up with it and graduate. Everybody who went through that and wrote about it said that the behavior of the other men to these cadets was absolutely outrageous, just horrible. It was just a disgrace that we treated them that way. But we did have 3 men, Flipper, Alexander, and Young, who graduated. We have in our midst a man who has studied the life of Henry Flipper, and he is our current resident authority on Lieutenant Flipper. If you would, let's give a few minutes of time and let Tony talk about the career and the life of Lieutenant Flipper. Yeah, give him a hand. Oh, yeah. You want to give him that? Sure, we'll do that. Why not? Take that right there. We'll stick this in your pocket.
Must be fine right here. That work? Another interesting thing I didn't notice in here, it may very well be in and I just missed it, but after Young graduated in 1889, it was 1940 before another black soldier graduated from West Point. It was a long time coming after that. Flipper, the main reason I really enjoy reading about him was he was actually from Georgia. He was from Thomasville down in South Georgia. It's pretty close to the Florida line. He was born in 1856 into a slave family, and his father was so good as a shoemaker that he actually bought their freedom. He saved up enough money and bought the whole family's freedom, and moved to Atlanta and started his own shoemaking business, where he actually built up enough money and sent all of his kids to college. Flipper started at Atlanta University. I don't remember the exact year he started at Atlanta University, but from there he went to West Point. He was actually the 5th African American to go to West Point, but he was the first to graduate. He went through the entire 4 years without really having anybody speak to him other than call him names and tell him how he shouldn't be there. So he spent the entire 4 years. I can't imagine like going through high school without ever having anybody speak to me except to, call me names or tell me how bad they hated me. After he graduated from West Point, he became the first commissioned black officer in the U.S. Army. He went to the 10th Cavalry and became a second lieutenant. And everything went along fine. He made he was an engineer, a real good engineer, and he had actually, in one of the forts in Texas that he was stationed at, or it may have been Oklahoma, I don't remember, he actually designed a pit for the latrines, they kept having problems with sickness, and they couldn't figure out what was going on, and the water was actually backing up and keeping all the bad stuff right there by them. And so they figured out a way to make everything drain away, and they kept telling him that it wouldn't work, that he had the drains going uphill, and he said, no, they're downhill, it'll work, and it did. They're still there. That's a national landmark. He stayed from 1878 to 1880 in the Buffalo Soldiers, and in 1881 he became the commissary and was accused of embezzling funds. It was right around $4,000 that just disappeared. Now, whether it disappeared out of his footlocker because he kept everything in his footlocker, whether somebody stole it or what happened, nobody knows for sure. It's known that it disappeared, and then it had shown back up. But he was court-martialed, and he was cleared of all the charges of embezzling the money, but he was found guilty of conduct unbecoming of an officer, and so he was court-martialed and thrown out of the Army. So after that, he was so fluent in Spanish, and he knew the Mexican land laws and mining laws so well that he actually spent most of the rest of his life pretty much mapping and settling land disputes and mining disputes between Arizona and Mexico. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Nogales, Mexico, and Nogales, Arizona. It's like one big city, but one side's in Mexico and one side's in Arizona. Well, it's not a huge city, but it's half and half. And he pretty much mapped all that out and settled all the land disputes back at that time. He was also a surveyor, a civil and military engineer, author, translator, special agent of the Justice Department, special assistant to the Secretary of the Interior, aide to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and like I said before, authority on Mexican land and mining laws. He spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name, and didn't do any good. He wrote constantly trying to get some government official to try to help clear his name, but it never happened in his lifetime. He died in Georgia in 1940, and he's buried in Thomasville. In 1999, Bill Clinton actually pardoned him, and they had more or less a Flipper appreciation day, and Clinton kind of told the things that he had accomplished in his life. That's pretty much it for me.
Okay, great. Give Tony a nice hand. Thank you, Tony. That picture, by the way, shows Lieutenant Flipper on the left, and that's his wife, Chloe, on the right. And that probably was taken not too long after graduation, I would think. Because he was pretty young. Okay. When's the last time anybody read to you? You probably were a child, right? Yeah. Hope we got one more. Let's go see the. Yeah. This is Colonel Young. He is the black officer who served the longest, and he had a 30-year career as a officer in the United States Army. This picture was taken when he was in Cuba and was serving with Blackjack Pershing. Young was the only black officer to serve in the Cuban Rebellion, and he also was at the battle that Teddy Roosevelt was famous for the going up San Juan Hill. So he was one of the black troopers who actually got to go up San Juan Hill. And the black cavalry played a very important part in the Cuban insurrection. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is the Charlie Russell drawing, and while I read to you, Jason's going to just show you a series of Russell sketches and drawings that were made from his trip out to Arizona in 1886 when he rode with the Buffalo Soldiers, and he wrote this story. And the white soldiers that you'll see in the pictures that Jason shows you are the officers who served. Officer Lieutenant Powhatan Clark is one of them, and the other one is Officer Lieutenant Carter P. Johnson. Both of these officers were with the 10th Cavalry, and he painted their pictures. One of the pictures, he did a lot of sketches and drawings and some pen and ink drawings in the field, and then he did some watercolors. You'll see one that is of a cowboy, or a soldier leading an empty horse, and it's called The Empty Horse. And that was done in the field. So you can see the kind of work that Remington did in the field. Then he went back to New York and did his oil paintings and his major works based upon his sketches and his drawings. And this will be reminiscent of when you were a child and people would read to you. But I want you to get a flavor both of Remington as a writer and also what it was like to travel with the Buffalo Soldiers. And this is called A Scout with the Buffalo Soldiers by Frederic Remington. And it was an article that he wrote after he came back from his trip to Arizona. I sat smoking in the quarters of an Army friend at Fort Grant. And through a green latticework, I was watching the dusty parade and congratulating myself on the possession of this spot of comfort in such a disagreeably hot climate as Arizona Territory offers in the summer, when in strode my friend the lieutenant, who threw his cap on the table and began to roll a cigarette. Well, he said, the CEO has ordered me out for 2 weeks scouting up San Carlos way, and I'm off in the morning. Would you like to go with me? He lighted the cigarette and paused for my reply. I was very comfortable at that moment and knew from some past experiences that marching under the summer sun of Arizona was real suffering and not to be considered by one pleasure bent. I was also aware that my friend the lieutenant had a reputation as a hard rider and would in this case select a few picked and seasoned cavalrymen and rush over the worst possible country in the least possible time. I had no reputation as a hard rider to sustain, and moreover had not backed a horse for the year past. I knew too that Uncle Sam's beans, black coffee, and the bacon, which every old soldier will tell you about, would fall to the lot of anyone who scouted with the 10th Dragoons. Still, I very much desired to travel through the country to the north, and in a rash moment said, I'll go. You quite understand that you are amiable to discipline, continued the lieutenant with mock seriousness as he regarded me with that soldier's contempt for a civilian that is not openly expressed but is tacitly felt. I do, I answered meekly. Put you afoot, citizen. Put you afoot, sir, at the slightest provocation. Understand? Pursued the officer in his sharp manner of giving commands. I suggest that after I chaffed a government saddle for a day or two, I should undoubtedly beg to be put afoot. And far from being a punishment, it might be a real mercy. That being settled, will you go down to the stable call and pick out a mount? You are one of the heavies. Remington was a big old fat guy. But I think we can outfit you, he said, and together we strolled down to where the bugle was blaring. At the Adobe Corral, the faded coats of the horses were being groomed by the black troopers in white frocks, for the 10th United States Cavalry is composed of colored men. The fine alkali dust of that country is continually sifting over all exposed objects, so that the pushing back of the dust was about as useful as pushing back the sea with a house broom. A fine old veteran cavalry horse detailed for a sergeant of the troop was selected to bear me on a trip. He was a large horse of a pony build, both strong and sound, except that he bore a heeled-up saddle gall, gotten probably during an old march upon an endless Apache trail. His temper had been ruined, and a grinning soldier said as he stood at a respectful distance, "Look out, sir, that old horse sure kick your head off, sir." The lieutenant assured me that if I could ride that animal and not start the old gall, I should be covered with glory. And as to the rest, what you don't know about cross-country riding in these parts, that horse does. Well satisfied with my mount, I departed. The evening numbers of rubber-muscled cavalry officers called me and drew me all sorts of horrible pictures from my fancy, which greatly amused them and duly filled me with dismal forebodings. "A man from New York comes out here to trifle with the dragoons," said one facetious chap, addressing my lieutenant. "And so now, old boy, you don't want to let him get away with the impression that the cavalry don't ride." I caught the suggestion that it was the purpose of those fellows to see that I was ridden down on that trip, and though I got my resolution to a sticking point, I knew knew that a pillory can outpreach a parson and that my resolutions might not avail against a hard saddle. On the following morning, I was awakened by the lieutenant's dog rubber, a soldier detailed as an officer's servant, and got up to array myself in my field costume. My old troop horse was at the door, and he eyed his citizen rider with malevolent gaze, and even the dumb beasts of the military, born of spirit as old as the first man who went forth to conquer his neighbor man. Down in front at the post traders was gathered the scouting party. A tall sergeant, grown old in the service, scarred in the battlefields, hardened by long marches, and short a product of the camp, stood by his horse's head. 4 enlisted men, picturesquely clad in the cavalry soldier's field uniform, and 2 packers mounted with diminutive bronco mules were in charge of 4 pack mules loaded with apparels or saddlebags and packs, and this was our party. Presently, the lieutenant issued from the headquarters office and joined us. An orderly led up his horse. "Mount," said the lieutenant, and swinging himself into the saddle, he started off the road. Out past the groups of adobe houses which constitute a frontier military village or post, we rode, stopping to water our horses at the little creek, now nearly dry, the last water for many miles on our trail, and presently emerged on the great desert. Together at the head of the little cavalcade rode the lieutenant and I, while behind in single file came the 5 troopers sitting loosely in the saddles with the long stirrup of the United States cavalry seat. Forage hats set well over their eyes, carbines, slickers, canteens, saddle pockets, and lariats rattling at their sides. Strung out behind were the 4 pack mules, now trotting demurely along, now stopping to feed, and occasionally making a solemn and evidently well-considered attempt to get out of line and regain their post which they were leaving behind. The packers brought up the rear, swinging their blinds and shouting at the lagging mules in a manner which evinced a very close acquaintance with the character and peculiarities of each beast. The sun was getting higher in the heavens and began to assert its full strength. The yellow dust rose about our horses' hooves and settled again over the dry grass and mesquite brush. Stretching away on our right was the purple line of the Sierra Bonitas, growing bluer and bluer until lost in the hot atmosphere of the desert horizon. Overhead stretched the deep blue of the cloudless sky. Presently we halted and dismounted to tighten our packs, which had worked themselves loose after the first hour. One by one the packers caught the little mules, threw the blinds over their eyes, and yelling, "Now, fella, ready! Hey, give me that loop!" came from the men as they heaved and tossed the circling ropes in the mystic movements of the diamond hitch. "All fast, Lieutenant," cries a packer, and mounting we move on up the slope towards the mesa, towards the Sierras. We enter a break in the foothills, and the grade becomes steeper and steeper until at last it rises an astonishing angle. The lieutenant shouts the command to dismount, and we obey. The bridle reins are tossed over the horses' heads, the carbines thrown butt forward up the backs of the troopers. A long drink is taken from the canteens, and I observe that each man pulls a plug of tobacco about a foot long from the capricious legs of his troop boots and wrenches off a chew. This greatly amused me, and I laughed as I pondered over the fertility of the soldier mind, and while I do not think that the original official military board which evolved the United States troop boot had this idea in mind, the adaptation of a means to an end reflects great credit on the intelligence of someone. Up the ascent of the mountain we toiled, now winding among the trees and the brush, scrambling up the precipitous slopes, picking a way across a field of scattered rock, or steadying our horses over the smooth surface of a boulder, until it seemed to my initiated mind that the cavalry was not equal to the emergencies of such a country. In the light of subsequent experiences, however, I feel confident that any cavalry officer who has ever chased Apaches would not hesitate a moment to command up Bunker Hill Monument. The slopes of the Sierra Bonitas are very steep, and since the air becomes more rarefied as we toiled upwards, I found myself panting for breath. My horse, a veteran mountaineer, grunted in his efforts and drew his breath in long and labored blowing. Consequently, I felt as though I was not doing anything unusual in puffing and blowing myself. The resolutions of the previous night needed considerable nursing, and though they were kept alive, at times I reviled myself for being such a fool as to do this sort of thing under the delusion that it was an enjoyable experience. On the trail ahead, I saw the lieutenant throw himself on the ground. I followed his example, for I was nearly done for. I never had felt a rock that was as soft as the one I sat on. It was literally downy. The old troop horse heaved a great sigh, and dropping his head went fast asleep, as every good soldier should do when he finds the opportunity. The lieutenant and I discussed the climb, and my voice was rather loud in pronouncing it beastly. My companion gave me no comfort, for he was a soldier and unapt to weep, And though he might have used his official prerogative to grumble, the Negro troopers sat about, their black skins shining with perspiration, and took no interest in the matter at hand. They occupied such time in joking and in merriment as seems fitted for growling. They may be tired and they may be hungry, but they do not seem fit to augment their misery by finding fault with everybody and everything. In this particular, they are charming men with whom to serve. Officers have often confessed to me that when they are on long and monotonous field service and are troubled with the depression of spirits, they have only to go about the campfires of the Negro soldier in order to be amused and cheered by the clever songs of the men. Personal relations are much closer with white officers and colored soldiers than in the white regiments, without breaking the necessary Army discipline. The men look up to a good officer, rely on him in trouble, and even ask him for advice in their affairs. In barracks, no soldier is allowed by his fellows to cuss out a just and respected superior. As to their bravery, will they fight? That is easily answered. They have fought many, many, many times. The old sergeant sitting near me, as calm a feature as a bronze statue, once deliberately walked over a Cheyenne rifle pit and killed his man. One little fellow near him once took charge of a lot of stampeded cavalry horses when the Apache bullets were flying loose and no one knew from what point to expect them next. These episodes prove the sometimes doubted self-reliance of the black trooper. After the most frugal lunch, we resumed our journey up towards the clouds, climbing many weary hours. We at last stood on the sharp ridge of the Sierra. Behind us, we could see the great yellow plain of Sulphur Spring Valley, and in front, stretching away, was the Gila, looking like a bed of sea with the water gone. Here the lieutenant took observations and busied himself by making an itinerary of the trail. In obedience with an order by the department of the commander, General Miles, scouting parties like ours are constantly being sent out from a chain of forts which surround the great San Carlos Reservation. The purpose is to make provision against Apache outbreaks which are momentarily expected by familiarizing officers and soldiers with the vast solitude of mountain and desert. We had needed a rest, and then we began our descent. We wound downward among the masses of rocks for some time. When we suddenly found ourselves in a shelf of rock, we sought to avoid it by going around, but after a tiresome march, we were still confronted by a drop of about 100 feet. I gave up in despair, but the lieutenant, after gazing at the unknown depths, which were masked at the bottom by a thick growth of brush, said, "This is a good place to go down." I agreed that it was once you got started, but personally I did not care to make the tumble. Taking his horse by the bits, the young officer began the descent. The slope was at an angle of at least 60 degrees, and he was covered with loose dirt and boulders, with the mask of a brush at the bottom concealing awful possibilities of what might be beneath. The horse hesitated a moment and then cautiously put its head down and his leg forward and started. The loose earth crumbled. A great stone was sent to the bottom with a crash. The horse slid and floundered along. Had the situation not been so serious, it would have been funny, because of the angle of the incline was so great that the horse actually sat down on his haunches like a dog. "Come on!" shouted the redoubtable man of war. And since I was next on the ledge and could not go back and let anyone pass, I remembered my resolutions. They prevailed against my better judgment, and I started. My old horse took it unconcerningly, and we came down all right, bringing our share of dirt and stones and plunging through the wall of brush at the bottom to find our friends safe on the lower side. The men got out a pack of Mexican cards and gambled in a game called Coon Can for a few nickels and dimes and other soldier currency tobacco. Quaint expressions came from the card party. "Now I was going to scare the life out of you when I show you this hand," said one man after a deal. The player addressed looked at his hand carefully and quietly rejoined, "You might scare me, pard, but you can't scare the cards that I got here." The utmost good nature seemed to prevail. They discussed the little things which made their lives. One man suggested that the big Jack Mule, he behaved himself pretty good this trip. He ain't done kicked nobody yet. Pipes were filled and smoked and returned to that cavalryman's grubstack, the bootleg, and the game progressed until the fire no longer gave sufficient light. Soldiers have no tents in that country, and we rolled ourselves up in the blankets and, gazing up, saw the weird figure of that sentinel against the last red gleam of sunset, and beyond that the great dome of sky set with stars, and then we fell asleep. Isn't that neat? I hope you like that, because it's that kind of writing that makes me love the Old West. You know, that's the kind of writing that makes you want to go to the desert. You want to see what it's like at nighttime in the Dragoon Mountains or the Sierra Madres or wherever it is that they write about, and he does a wonderful job of giving you a sense of what the open country is like. The pictures that you saw were all done by Frederick Remington. This last one is Teddy Roosevelt on the left going up San Juan Hill. And even though it is not filled with the Buffalo Soldiers, that's the painting that he did of his time in Cuba. And that's, of course, where Colonel Young and his men were with him when he went up, although they don't appear in this picture. What's that? You see? Oh yeah, there's one right there. Okay, so there is a Buffalo Soldier in the group. Remington went to Cuba. As he said when he went there, he said, to paint what men do best. What men do best, he said, was war. But after he saw it firsthand and he saw men dying in his arms, he changed his mind. And when he came back, he realized how much he hated war. And he no longer wanted to glorify it, but rather to tell the story of how horrible it was. And his paintings in his final years tended to be more impressionistic and more universal than simply battle scenes of combat. In the Booth Western Art Museum, we have a number of examples of black soldiers, Buffalo Soldiers. And this one here is called the Old Soldier Reigns. And Old Soldier Reigns is probably a Indian Wars period, although once again, it's got a yellow scarf. So it's one of those things where if I was going to do it, I wouldn't do a yellow scarf because everybody expects there to be a yellow scarf. But this is a wonderful sculpture and really probably very reflective of how those men looked. It's the 10th Cavalry, and he's got a 10th Cavalry uniform. The other paintings, or the two paintings that we have, are done by Bob Vann, who is from Tubac, Arizona. He had gone to Arizona because a friend of his was a cowboy and had a ranch and invited him out there. And he went out there and fell in love with Arizona, with the West, the whole subject of painting the West. And Bob Vann really specializes in Buffalo Soldiers in that period of time. There's a couple of things about this painting that Bob Vann would like you to know about. First of all, he's got holes in the shirt, and that's deliberate because, as Bob Vann would point out, and which is certainly true, that because of the prejudice against the black men in the service, they almost never got the first stuff. They never got the best stuff. It was always the what was left over, what was handed down, and they were often sent out into the field to fight the most dangerous battles with the poorest equipment. And so here is a man who probably is in 1880 using a pistol that was a Civil War pistol from 1865. He's got a shirt that's falling apart, and he's got old Civil War period issue things, even though this is supposedly in the 1880s. This is called Flipper, right? Isn't it? Oh, it's not called Flipper. It's called Officer of the 10th or Lieutenant? Yeah, Second Lieutenant, 9th Cavalry. It's a difficult thing to say who that is because there wouldn't have been a lieutenant other than those three guys we talked about available to serve, and we don't think it's any one of those guys. Wouldn't have been Flipper. It wouldn't have been Alexander. Wouldn't have been Young. Really, in truth, yeah. Bob
Vann said even though it probably represents Flipper, he purposely named it that because it would have represented the
It's a potential black officer rather than a specific black officer. Right. Let's see the next one. The next one is also Bob Vann's, and this is the 10th Cav. You can see the guide on with the 10th A Company, 10th Cavalry, and they again are using weapons that are very, very old. This is the battle fighting Victoria. And this would have been 1880, 1881, and at that time, everybody else in the Army would have had trapdoor Springfields and single-action Army Colts. These guys are using much older, more antique weapons to fight the battle. And again, they're using Civil War belts and Civil War uniform pieces. And in this particular painting, you can see the individual style that Bob Van brings to his painting. He has a very rich but almost slightly primitive way of mixing his paints and of applying his pigments with sort of heavy outlining, which creates a very, very distinctive look for his particular work. And Bob Van was one of the first people that we recorded, or the first person we recorded. He was actually the first person that Jason and Seth did an interview with for our historical studies, and when we get a chance, we will play you those videotapes so that you can see what he had to say about his work and his art.
Those the total interviews are about an hour and 45 minutes long. So
okay, so we got an hour and 45 minutes of material that you can go to the library and watch at some point in the future, and we will probably crystallize it down where someday we'll have a lunch and learn where we'll show you the video interview.
We'll actually have those produced. We've got, I believe, 4 or 5 of them complete now. We'll have them kind of condensed down to a 30-minute program about the artists
Good.
themselves.
So someday we'll have some programs for you to see of interviews with the artists talking about their work.